So it's taking me a while to get my next video out. It turns out watching several shows, OVAs and movies, and then crafting a compelling thesis on them, it takes more than a month. So in the meantime, I'd like to have something easy out. Something that won't take too much effort, something that's kind of chill. So I'm unveiling the first episode of What I Have Been Watching, which will be just that, stuff I've been watching. No super deep thoughts here, no in-depth academic thesis, just a little relaxing bumper while I go through stuff I've seen lately, and let you all know what I thought of them. This is a chill corner is what I'm saying. Big thoughts left at the door.
Godzilla, Mothra and King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All-Out Attack.
Godzilla, Mothra and King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All-Out Attack was released in 2001 during the Millennium era of Godzilla films. If people don't know, the Godzilla films are generally broken into 4 distinct eras. The Showa films from 1954 to 1975, the Heisei films from 1984 to 1995, the Millennium films from 1999 to 2005, and the Reiwa era, which we are currently in. The Millennium era was also during the Heisei period, technically, but the break after the American Godzilla remake is generally seen as a style shift moment. And the Millennium era generally seems to be defined by a lack of consistent style. Almost every movie in the period is a reboot, each film using only the original film as its basis. Which is a little strange when you consider that most of these were released only a year apart from each other. All Out Attack was directed by Shusuke Kaneko, who in the 90s had previously directed the very acclaimed Gamera trilogy. He's a natural choice then, because each of those movies reinvent the character in surprising and exciting ways. The first is this Spielbergian sweeping adventure that even got the Roger Ebert thumbs up. The second is this grungier procedural drama, and I've still not seen the third one, but I hear it's very post-Eva in vibe. I've talked about Kaneko on this channel before. He directed Summer Vacation 1999, the Heart of Thomas adaptation. He's actually a really interesting guy for me in the way that his career kind of charts big changes in Japanese pop culture. He begins making Pinku films before briefly diving into art house cinema, and then moving into kaiju and anime adaptations. To some degree, special effects director Shinji Higuchi probably deserves as much credit for the success of those Gamera films, but Kaneko is clearly an interesting guy in his own right. Maybe not a full-on auteur, but someone who has built a unique filmography on bridging live action and anime styles. All Out Attack is generally considered by Godzilla fans to be one of the better films from this period. And I can see why, because this thing clearly has a take on the big lizard. If I was to guess how Kaneko pitched this movie, I'm pretty sure it was, what if we did Godzilla as a ghost story? The protagonists are TV producers who make cheap paranormal documentaries. In this version, they learn from a mysterious old man, who is probably a ghost, that Godzilla is fueled by the souls of those killed in Asia during World War II. When Godzilla appears, he is malevolent and unforgiving. His eyes are all white, he destroys a hospital. He's a bad guy in this one. And in this version, Mothra and Ghidorah are Shinto gods, tasked with defending Japan from this malevolent rage spirit Godzilla. So I really love the first half of this movie. One of the most enjoyable parts of kaiju cinema for me is when they explore what a world that has dealt with monsters would be like. How would it change culture and become part of life? So to that end, I really enjoy how in this movie, the original Godzilla attack has become a historical memory. Like this scene where characters discuss how the Big G was just a misunderstood animal who shouldn't have been killed. And I think choosing to do this as a horror movie, a ghost story even, is really effective, especially in this opening act, going for eerie when depicting the monsters and their environments. I think this has become kind of a gauche opinion online, but I do think at their worst, Godzilla films can make you dread the moments with humans. And I think this happens the most when the human stuff feels disconnected from the monster story, when there isn't a clear thematic or plot parallel between their struggles. I didn't have that problem here for a few reasons. One being that Kaneko is just a real director, and he adds enough visual flair to the human stuff to make it engaging. And two, the main character Yuri, her central plot is an investigation into Godzilla and discovering its nature. So the narrative is presented as a mystery about the central monster. The decision here to have Godzilla be a manifestation of Japan's war guilt is really, as the kids say, based. I had heard about this plot element before, but I'd always wondered if it had been kind of overstated in the way that fan bases sometimes do with the most interesting parts of their stuff. But no, they explicitly say in this movie that Godzilla is being powered by the souls of those killed in Asia by the Imperial military. If you compare this to -1, a movie I do really like, but which is only really interested in Japan as the victim of World War II, in the way in which the Imperial military mechanized the bodies of Japanese pilots, this film becomes even more impressive in comparison. This is a movie from 2001, which I believe played as a double bill with a Hamtaro movie, and it has a much more critical stance of Japan's wartime history than -1, a film from 2023. But this is also where my slight issue comes in with the film, which is once you get to that last act and the monster fights really start happening, these elements do become a lot less relevant. It's no longer about Yuri's investigation into Godzilla or about Godzilla's relationship to World War II. It's about the titular all-out attack. I wish the finale could have involved Yuri a bit more, and somehow bridged its historical themes with the defeat of Godzilla. Other films have done a good job of this, like how in the original, the decision to use the oxygen destroyer mirrors Godzilla's origins, or in -1, how it becomes about whether self-sacrifice is necessary, or in Shin Godzilla, how it becomes about banding together to animate Gunbuster. Something similar here, which could have linked defeating the monster to the themes of wartime guilt, would, I think, have really elevated the conclusion. At the same time, I do think the way to look at these Godzilla movies is to understand the storytelling as happening through the characterization of Godzilla. How he's depicted, what fears he's embodying, that's where the thematic content is often located in these films. How Godzilla looks, how he moves, what emotions he inspires, that often tells you what the story is about, and that's where the ideas are being expressed. So in Shin Godzilla, you have a story of environmental catastrophe with existential stakes, and you have the monster as this decayed, bleeding, mutating, agonized creature, mirroring a nation that worries it's on the brink of collapse. In the original film, you have a manifestation of wartime trauma, and so you have a monster that leaves trails of fire in its wake, reminiscent of World War II fire bombings. In a lot of Showa films, you have Godzilla as a protector of the Earth, often as a kind of environmental hero. And so he's a figure of power and wish fulfillment, but he's also cuddly and silly and a little petulant. And in this movie, we do have Godzilla as demonic force. Like this scene where he bites down on Ghidorah's neck and draws blood, or the way he cleaves through these battleships. It's a really impressive piece of action, and it sells you on Godzilla as malevolent force.
Godzilla against Mechagodzilla, 2002.
I also watched Godzilla against Mechagodzilla, another Millennium-era film, this one directed by Masaaki Tezuka, and made only a year later, in 2002. And I think watching these two back-to-back, you see two very different but equally valid ways of making a Godzilla film. Whereas Kaneko's film is going for this toned down, I think almost James Cameron's The Abyss-like aesthetic, Tezuka's is much more cartoony from the start. It has no issues with, in the first 10 minutes, cutting to footage from Showa-era monster movies, as the Prime Minister lets us know which films are canon to this story, which, by the way, is kind of an odd and hilarious choice. So most of these Millennium films just go, oh yeah, the original Godzilla attack is canon, but nothing else. This one does that, and then is like, oh yeah, just so you know, just while we have you, the Mothra film also happened in this timeline, and so did that weird one where Frankenstein becomes monster-sized, but not the first one, sorry, the second one where Frankenstein becomes monster-sized. The first one might not be canon. Don't worry about it. Even though neither of those monsters appear in this movie, I'm not complaining, I'm just curious what the thinking was here. I love the visual style of Tezuka's film, even though it's very much the inverse of what Kaneko is going for. Tezuka's Godzilla has these soft colors, and no attempt is really made to go for realism in the kaiju battles. Godzilla in this movie looks kind of cat-like and cute, and the battles feel cartoony in the best possible way. Godzilla against Mechagodzilla is not trying to be very ambitious. This isn't a rethinking of Godzilla as a character or an attempt at a different genre. It's a very pared down story with quite archetypical characters, but they're all very likable. You've got the protagonist, Akane Yashiro. She's a pilot dealing with war guilt over a previous battle with Godzilla, and she's very competent and no nonsense. A lot of these 2000s Godzilla films seem to have pretty strong female main characters, which is really cool. Then the other major character is the scientist who builds Mechagodzilla, Tokimitsu Yuhara. He's a widow, and his daughter, Sarah, builds a really adorable relationship with Akane over the course of the movie. Like I say, none of this is revelatory, but it works. You like the characters, you like seeing them bond, and because they are scientists and soldiers, their struggles are very connected to the kaiju stuff. And of course, the concept of this movie is that Akane is going to pilot the Mechagodzilla. And I love that because this is the early 2000s, this version of Mechagodzilla is biomechanical, built from the skeleton of the previous Godzilla, and even occasionally going berserk mode. You'll love to see it. This is a lean, pared-down Godzilla action movie, and I just got really good vibes from the whole thing. Interestingly, this is the only Millennium-era film to get a direct, in-continuity sequel, and it makes sense. I can see why that would be, because the cast feels like a really great foundation for more stories. This might sound like kind of an insult, and I don't mean it in that way, but this sort of felt like, to me, a pilot for a Godzilla TV show. And it would work really well in that sense, because you've got a great base of characters, you've got great relationships. It feels like a springboard for more stories. And in that sense, it is a bit odd that we got one sequel to this, and then they did Final Wars, which is kind of like, we're wiping the slate clean, we're going to finish Godzilla for a little while and put it on ice. That's a bit strange to me. I guess these films just weren't making that much money by that point. But yeah, I mean, watching this, it made me think that doing a Godzilla movie should not be as hard as it's made out. All you really need is some likable characters and a few good monster fights, and folks, that's cinema. You got yourself a movie. A big part of it too, obviously, is just the aesthetic and the texture of seeing these rubber suits. You know, I mean, it's just so kind of satisfying to me in a lizard-brained way to see these monsters that have been handcrafted fighting in these miniature sets.
Gundam Requiem for Vengeance trailer.
Gundam Requiem for Vengeance is a CG Gundam miniseries developed by an American studio and set to premiere on Netflix in October. I actually really want to be excited for this because I find Western interpretations of Gundam fascinating. Personally, I am glad to live in the timeline where a cheap Canadian live-action TV movie of Gundam exists. To me, though, unfortunately, this trailer seems like all the ways you wouldn't want to advertise Gundam to a newcomer. Dropping them directly into the one-year war, a conflict they have no reason to care about. There's a lot of clunky exposition, including about new types, which I don't think you would really want to front-load to a new audience. From the trailer, part of the pitch of this series seems to be imagine how scary it would be to encounter the Gundam as a regular soldier. And I don't think that's a bad concept, but it's also really well-worn territory at this point, and I would need to know what their new take on this material is to be excited. Like, you find that concept of being a grunt against a much more powerful Gundam explored really well in Gundam Thunderbolt. While not exactly the same, MS Igloo has a lot of stuff about ground soldiers and tank units fighting against superior mobile suits. The ongoing manga, The Tales of Flanagan Boone, has a really unique take on this. Not only is it about regular soldiers fighting against the original Gundam, but the story is also directly within their perspective, with said Gundam presented as this nightmarish eldritch creature. Among all these works, I'm not really seeing anything that sets this series apart. Maybe there will be something going for this in the final product, but right now this basically looks like what you'd get if you combined every one-year war OVA that already exists. I've seen a lot of people also complain about the CGI. I do think it looks really rough, and it's kind of wild that it's all done in Unreal Engine, but I also think the CG for like a lot of the Star Trek and Star Wars cartoons looks kind of bad, and I don't really see people complain about that as much, so I'm not sure that's as much of an issue for me. Like, I don't think the CG looks great, but I can deal with it if the story is really good or the direction is really good. I'm also in agreement with a lot of people in the fandom right now in being kind of tired of stories set during this particular conflict. One-year war stories have this habit of blending together into kind of collage of non-specific World War II imagery. Like, we get it, Zeon are fascists who co-opted Space Noid liberation, etc., etc., but We have seen that story told so many times now. I'd be much more interested in exploring other time periods and factions. I'd love a story, for instance, about the Echoas unit from Gundam Unicorn. What's their ideology? What's their background? One of the reasons I like Thunderbolt so much, and particularly past the first few volumes, which I know is where a lot of people kind of drop off that series, but for me that's where it gets interesting, because it creates all these new factions that represent different parts of UC culture. It's also one of the reasons I find Hathaway's Flash so fascinating, because it explores this period of UC history we rarely see, and gives us a much deeper insight into how the factions function. In contrast, at their worst, one-year war stories can feel to me like a series of cobbled-together World War II movie cliches. Anyway, my brain, as I'm sure you all know, has been thoroughly fried by Gundam, so I will, of course, watch this. I'll probably even do a video on it. I would like to be surprised. I do want this to be good. And hey, I do find this character design ridiculously hot, so that's something.
Gregg Araki's Teenage Apocalypse Trilogy.
It's kind of funny that online reactionaries always act like themes of gender fluidity and performance are some kind of new thing that the culture has conjured in the last 5 years. And simultaneously, you see a lot of these online reactionaries deifying the 90s as this period of fixed gender roles and a lack of kind of alternative scenes and just political normality. And they view it that way because they were kids in the 90s. They were children. They just weren't aware of politics. They just weren't aware of subcultures. But that is wild because 90s independent cinema was kind of the peak of gender fluid, queer, independent directors to that point. And particularly Gregg Araki's stuff. Reactionaries cannot be allowed to simultaneously yearn for the 1990s as the decade of Blockbuster and Pizza Hut, and ignore that this was also the period of Seattle grunge and new queer cinema and alt-GF dominance. I mean, there's a reason why Portlandia opens with a song about Portland, its leftist hippie shibboleth, as being where the dream of the 90s still exists.
Do you remember the 90s?
Yeah.
You know, people were talking about getting piercings and getting tribal tattoos.
Yeah.
I recently watched the excellently named Teenage Apocalypse Trilogy, a series of low-budget films Gregg Araki made from 1993 until 97, dealing with queer themes and featuring teenage protagonists mired in a sense of disaffected apathy. As the tagline for the second of these films says, sex, violence, whatever. The first of the trilogy, Totally Fucked Up, is probably my least favourite of the three. It's also maybe the most serious, the most realistic, and the most documentary-like, so, you know, I maybe just hate reality. Still, it's got naturalistic characters and beautiful nighttime LA photography. It's probably the most directly issues-based of these movies, with the later ones going in more cartoony, abstract directions. Anyway, I loved its follow-up, The Doom Generation. This movie follows these three teenage drifters who go on a road trip across this very aggro, insane version of America as they keep basically accidentally killing people. The Doom Generation is part of a style of 90s road trip story in which the world just seems slightly off. Like an alternate reality in which things aren't quite Kafka-esque, but they are about 20% shittier. Reality's antagonisms turned up just a little bit. Corporate excess is even more excessive, people are just slightly more open about their ignorance, and the 20th century's worst ideologies haunt the present. So it's the 1990s on steroids. Key to this, and to every movie in Araki's Teen Apocalypse trilogy, is a mainstream society that is homophobic and stifling and views individuality with suspicion. In a way, what this reminded me of was the satire of American culture present in classic Simpsons, just with more gunfights and MMF threesomes. The America presented here is mean and dumb. It proclaims no ideology other than vague family values, while more pernicious ones lie under the surface. And in the midst of this dumb, bad, hostile culture, the best thing to do is tune out and have bisexual trysts. Anyway, this thing also looks amazing. As part of the road trip structure, they stop off in different hotels, each of which looks absolutely horrendous. Like real sicko shit. Look at this. And the fashion in this movie is just, this is like the only way I want to dress now. I also really enjoy actor James Duval as Gregg Araki's sort of muse in these movies. He inhabits a really interesting space. He's sort of gender neutral, kind of feminine and pretty, but also in this naive, wholesome stoner, almost Bill and Ted-esque way in his affect. In both this and the following movie, he plays someone who could be a loser. He's kind of inert and passive, but under Araki's lens and played by Duval, there's something kind of stylish and innocent and beautiful about him. James Duval is kind of a classic shoujo bishonen is what I'm saying. The final film of this trilogy, Nowhere, feels more slight than the Doom generation, but it's still very good and very much an extension of the Doom generation's styles. By which I mean, it's very heavily stylized and very cartoony. It's the same world, really. This world of televangelists and people waiting for the rapture and a lot of adrift stoner teens. But Nowhere is different in that it uses a huge ensemble cast, weaving in and out of different stories. It's connected by a party each one of the characters is trying to get to, but other than that, their stories vary quite a bit in tone. You've got the kid who wants to try and impress his girlfriend but gets carjacked. There's a girl who meets a terrible TV star, and most enjoyably, James Duval plays the stoner kid who keeps seeing his friends getting vaporized by an alien. Araki described this one as Beverly Hills 90210 on acid, and yeah, that's basically it. There's nothing super deep going on here, but I had a lot of fun with it, and it's nice to see that style from the Doom generation extended a bit. So for a lot of the 2010s, I basically didn't play much in the way of video games. There were a bunch of reasons for this: moving away to uni, deciding I wanted to focus entirely on the film canon, as well as the sense that the type of game I liked most, choice-based RPGs, weren't being made in the way I wanted them to anymore. But this also meant I missed out on a lot of cool stuff, and I've realized there's a lot of gaps in my pop culture knowledge as a result. So I've been trying to go through the canon of what I missed from that decade that is generally well regarded. It's an ongoing process, but for now I've played
Dark Souls.
I think what I appreciated most about Dark Souls is the way playing it began to register as a kind of mindfulness exercise. In traversing areas and fighting enemies, it became about exercising caution and being deliberate in my movements. In the tougher boss fights, it became about being present in every moment, not thinking seconds ahead or getting frustrated at actions seconds in the past, but reacting to exactly what was happening in that moment, instantly and appropriately. Those boss fights in particularly gave me that time slowing down and seeing the reality code Neo feeling that I've previously only had from very hard bullet hell games. Of course, I'm very late to this. Everyone has played Dark Souls and everyone now loves it. I have no immediate attraction to this game because aesthetically, I simply do not care about dark fantasy stuff. But as an activity, it became a surprisingly calming and meditative exercise, and I was very glad to have played it.
Undertale.
Playing Undertale in 2024 feels like arriving late at a party that at some point became really bad vibes, but at least the tunes are good. Undertale is really good. I'm sure the fans got very obnoxious about stuff in the 2010s, but that's what fandom does. Having been miraculously unspoiled on the game in the decade that it's been out, I came away thoroughly charmed and fairly emotionally worked over. To my own surprise, though, I was even more taken with
DeltaRune.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's only 2 chapters out, but this thing has really wormed its way into my subconscious. I love that it's essentially functioning as the Digimon Tamers of this franchise, the more ambitious, more angsty sequel to the beloved classic. Impossible to say whether this thing will work when it's all done. There's clearly a lot of big ideas here that could go south, and I'm not sure how I feel about all the kind of mystery box elements that are in here. But what this has, and the reason I've now played each chapter 3 times, is an excellent JRPG party. Susie is the John Hughes-esque lesbian I never knew I wanted in a game, and Ralze, look how perfect he is. He's so good. Anyway, yeah, that is it for now. I'll try not to be too long getting my next actual video out, but as always, thank you to my patrons for keeping this all running, and yeah, thank you very much. Okay, bye folks.